Okay, this week, week 3, we're moving from the first part of the course into the second part, which will focus on major traditions of evaluation, starting off with a couple of weeks on paradigms, theories, branches, and philosophical assumptions. So while we're still learning some basic terminology and some basic ideas, as you see this week, we also jump right into the deep end of some more conceptual material, which could be difficult for some folks if they haven't experienced some of these terms before. However, I really hope that you'll see as we go throughout the rest of the semester and as we get into the how-to section, section 3, that you'll see that this conceptual, theoretical, paradigmatic stuff really is necessary. It really is helpful. You can't, like Schwant says, you can't just have technical evaluation without cultivating a life of the mind for practice as well. But just to touch on some of these key terms that are, I think most of you know these already, but just in case you've missed a couple, let's just get them out in the open here, because these are foundational terms that we will need to come back to time and time again. So we have firstly formative and summative evaluation, where as many of you have correctly stated in your discussion or in your CRRs, formative evaluation is while a program is ongoing and it's used to keep continually forming that program or improving the program, whereas summative evaluation occurs after a program is done and is somewhat akin to an impact evaluation, looking at the outcomes or impact of that program once it's done to make decisions about the program. This is a bit parallel to the second set of distinctions. As usual with evaluation, there's some fuzziness in the terms, but it's important to know these terms because they are used in the field and in the literature. Process evaluation is similar to formative evaluation, but really what it's looking at is the processes of a program. So if you have a curriculum, or if you have a standard approach to teaching a particular topic, a process evaluation would look at, for instance, the implementation of that educational protocol. A process evaluation could also look at logistics, basic functioning of the program, the educational program. Outcomes look at outcomes, so changes in knowledge, attitude, behavior, whatever the desired outcomes of the program are. Also, it's important to, I don't have it written down here, but it's important to note that there are both intended outcomes and unintended outcomes. And not all evaluation approaches are necessarily adept at getting at unintended outcomes. As we start looking through the different varieties and the different types of evaluations, we'll see which are more well-placed to look at unintended outcomes. This distinction has come up already in some of your written pieces, which is the distinction between external and internal evaluators. Very many of you who are engaged in various programs in your current professions would be essentially internal evaluators. That is to say, not only are you internal to the organization, where you're evaluating a program run by the organization that you work for, but you might actually be evaluating your own program. And we'll see a little bit down the way, we'll see that that's what's called participatory or collaborative evaluation, and it's quite common. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are biased or that your biases will get in the way of having an objective evaluation. Equally common are external evaluators, which in fact most members of the American Evaluation Association are evaluation consultants that work either independently or work with a firm of others who look for contracts to do evaluations. So they oftentimes have a subject matter expertise. You might be an expert in K through 12 STEM education, or an expert in agricultural extension, or an expert in health education. So you have your niche, but you can go around looking for contracts in that area, and then you don't necessarily know anyone in the organization. You come in from the outside and work on an evaluation for a given period of time, write the report, and then move on. Monitoring evaluation, we've already covered. Meta-evaluation is an interesting topic that Wilson and that Mertens and Wilson rather cover, and that is the evaluation of evaluation. And it would be ironic if we didn't have meta-evaluation, because then we wouldn't be practicing what we preach. But it's actually not that common. Very often people just do evaluation without any real reflection on the quality of that evaluation. Evaluand is a silly technical term, but it pops up in the literature a lot. Michael Scriven coined that term and then also sort of regrets doing so because it's such a jargony term. But it simply means the thing that's being evaluated. Now that could be a program, but that also could be some personnel evaluation, could be product evaluation, could be policy evaluation. There are lots of different things, if you will, that could be evaluated. And evaluand just stands in for that notion. Merit and worth, I'm not going to go into that now because I want you to play around with that in the discussion, but it's fundamental to Scriven's very well-known definition. And to be honest, I myself had a bit of difficulty for the longest time to really parse out and understand what's the difference between merit and worth. But I think that Mertens and Wilson do a good job with that. Along with Trosham, Mertens and Wilson also, and many others, dive into what's the difference between evaluation and research. Again, there are different perspectives on this. Some people see them as more overlapping or more separate. I'll leave that up to you to see where you come down on that question. And then getting back to Michael Scriven, we'll clearly talk about him a lot because he's an important figure in the field. This notion, it just appears very briefly in the readings this week, the notion of a transdiscipline. So Scriven has really maintained that this is what evaluation is. It's not a discipline like sociology or psychology, because getting a little bit back to that more general definition of evaluation, the more everyday type of thing that Schwant talks about a bit, evaluation, making evaluative judgments, according to Scriven, actually occurs in almost every other discipline, certainly every science. A historian is looking through archival material and is judging whether a certain source is credible and contributes to what sheer he is doing or not. That is an evaluation. Scientists, microbiologists, bench scientists are actually doing little evaluations all the time. So just like statistics or logic, Scriven sees evaluation as being a transdiscipline, yet one that also has its own professional norms as well, as we've seen with the guiding principles and the joint standards in this week's readings as well. So now that we've just quickly established some of the definitional glossary type terms that you definitely need to know moving on, let's jump into some of this theory stuff. Now, I've experienced with lots of working evaluators, that is to say the consultants that make up the largest portion of the American Evaluation Association. Many people actually say that they don't like theory, that they find theory to be too difficult to understand or not that useful or practical in their everyday work. It's interesting to see one of the chapters by Mertens and Wilson citing Will Shadish, who was another sort of founder of the field, saying that if you don't know evaluation theory, then you're not an evaluator. It could sound a little bit elitist or highfalutin, but it's really what sets apart those accidental evaluators, someone who's just doing evaluation methodology, from someone who is fully engaged in reflective evaluation practice. But I really like this quote from Kurt Lewin, who is one of the early promoters of action research, which has some things in common with evaluation, when he said, "There is nothing so practical as a good theory." So that's the challenge I lay before you, is as we go through these next few chapters of the text, actually, and look at the paradigms, the philosophical assumptions, and the role of theory in evaluation, that that we work to connect it to our daily practice as educators, or whatever it is that we're doing in the world. So the metaphor which is used, and when we talk about branches, it's drawn from some of the work by Marv Alkin, who was one of the first scholars to try to classify the different branches or types of branches of thought, really, in evaluation theory. And actually, as Mertens and Wilson point out, and many others have now sort of gone along with this, the metaphor might not be the best, because in practice, in reality, the theories and practices of evaluation tend to blend together a lot more. So the metaphor of a river or multiple rivers or an ecosystem of rivers running together through the forest is perhaps a better metaphor as we think about the different branches. So somebody might be primarily a use-focused evaluator, but for one given project or one specific purpose might go into more social justice or more methods-driven. It depends. And you this week, actually, in the activity, I'll be asking you to sort of take a stand, and even though the semester is young, just sort of place yourself amongst these different paradigms or branches, with the understanding that things shift, things change over time, and even within a given project or a given evaluation, there could be a blending together of these. So it's not hard and fast. You're not an either or. I don't think that's what anybody is saying. So the role of theory in evaluation is multiple, actually, and I think this classification is really helpful in thinking about that. There's paradigms all around. Those are the sort of philosophical assumptions, and we'll get back to those in just a second. But the three circles in the horizontal line across the middle: program theory, evaluation theory, and social science theory. That's what feeds in. Those three, influenced by paradigms, those three feed into the decisions we make about what evaluation model or evaluation approach to use. So, and I want you to work on some of these questions in the discussion section this week as well. But just really briefly, program theory refers to theory about how an intervention or how a program is supposed to work. So this is largely represented in something like a logic model or a log frame. We'll get to that in a couple weeks. But trying to map out or lay out the theory of how a program is supposed to lead to change in the world, how activities lead to outcomes, etc. I know that many people who work in cooperative extension probably have had to create logic models for their programs in the past, and anyone who has submitted a grant application, depending on the funder, most USDA NIFA grant proposals require a logic model to help articulate the education and extension component of the grant, although it depends on the type of grant. Then on the far right, you have social science theory. So anyone who's taken qualitative research or any sort of sociological course was probably, and even other courses in ALCE, would have encountered social science theories. And there's actually a vast array of social science theories, and even different scales. For some people, when you see social science theory, you're thinking really vast, big T theories, like Marxism, for instance. That would be one. All the way down to feminism would be another one. All the way down to more micro theories about, for instance, within psychology, there's different theories about how children learn, about how humans grow, about how societies interact. So those would all be social science theories, which, especially if you're trying to take a quote-unquote evidence-based approach, those theories should influence how you think about your evaluation. And then in the middle, there's those parts that Will Shadish said one needs to know in order to truly be an evaluator. I will say, however, that it is a bit contested. Some folks say, we don't really have well-formed evaluation theory. We don't have evaluation theories that have been empirically tested or that have been well articulated. Very often, the theories are related to evaluation models and approaches. So you could have some theories that have been relatively well developed are theories of use. That is to say, when someone completes an evaluation and has a report, has findings, how are those evaluation findings used? So Michael Patton has done some research on use. Carol Weiss in the past has done some research on use and misuse of evaluation. So that would be an evaluation specific theory. Michael Scriven, Jane Davidson, others, they have theories about how evaluators make that summative value judgment to synthesize data and findings into a judgment about merit, worth, significance, or value. So that would be an evaluation specific theory as well. Empowerment evaluation, different experimental designs and everything that connects to the assumptions about what types of knowledge those evaluation designs can create, those would perhaps be considered evaluation theories as well. So this figure 2.1, this is an important touchstone to come back to as we go throughout the next few weeks and see how theory is supposed to be influencing evaluation. So now on to the philosophical assumptions and the paradigms. Mertens and Wilson break it down into these 4 categories, which have been categories that have been used by other authors as well. So I think they're pretty handy, so we can use them as a sort of rule of thumb. There's axiology, there's ontology, there's epistemology, and methodology. So methodology is probably the most common to you. If you've taken any sort of research class or even just in everyday language, we talk about methods and methodology, which is just like what it sounds. It's the study or the practice of gathering systematic data and information on some phenomenon, something that you want to know about. Now, backing up from that, we see sort of in reverse order as it appears on the screen, in order to make good decisions about methodology, you probably ought to think at least a little bit about epistemology, which is to say, what is the nature of knowledge? How can we know? What is knowledge? So certain methodologies, like a survey, produce a certain type of knowledge about a phenomenon or about the world, whereas other methodologies, like interviews or journaling or observation, produce other types of knowledge. Not all types of knowledge are seen as equally credible and equally valuable. It depends, as always, on it depends on a lot of things, but largely it depends on stakeholders. If you go back to, remember that original sort of touchstone definition that we shared in week 1, which is about getting credible, accurate, useful data in a way that's feasible, and the credible, accurate, and useful really depends on stakeholders. So fundamentally, those are epistemological questions. How is some knowledge useful or credible or accurate for one person, but then not for another person? Then if you push that even further, and not everybody does, but in this course we're going to go there, which is beyond just thinking about knowledge, it could push you to have to think about the nature of reality. Now we'll come back to this over the next couple of weeks, and I'll actually post a couple of additional readings just in case you want to go further, both about the social theory question and what are the different types of social theory, and then in this case, how might we think about different or multiple realities. There are some evaluators who, at the very least, they're constructivist, meaning they see that knowledge is constructed by actors in the world, by different people, in different ways, so that my experience of a given phenomenon or a given experience might be different than yours. Is it just because we're looking at it differently and we have different perceptions, or are we fundamentally living in different realities? These questions might seem academic or might seem a little bit abstract, but in evaluation they can sometimes become very concrete, especially in contexts where there's intercultural or cross-cultural work that needs to be done. There's a rather large movement now within evaluation for culturally responsive evaluation, and also there's a group of folks focused on indigenous methodologies. And within indigenous evaluation, the notion of respecting indigenous ontologies or indigenous understandings of reality, which might not mesh with quote-unquote modern scientific versions of reality that we work with in the West, in the US. Those are important considerations if you're trying to get to a valid evaluation. So like I said, I'll post a sort of mind-bending reading about how we might begin to imagine different realities and what that means for then methodology, whether it's research or evaluation. And then axiology is a term that Mertens and Wilson use to talk about ethics. And so we've seen ethics are important in evaluation. Just getting an IRB approval doesn't necessarily make an ethical evaluation. There's all sorts of ethical quandaries, like in the case study that we looked at last module. But so axiology is just a parallel way of thinking about the assumptions about what is ethical, what is not. So we've got axiology, ontology, epistemology, and methodology. These are terms we'll come back to quite a bit. So keep playing around with them. Ask me any questions you might have about them, and we'll try to get to the bottom of this. Oh, and I forgot this one, praxeology, because that's not included in the Mertens and Wilson, but it's from some other literature that I find helpful. And that is very simply, or not, about the nature of human action. So in that sense, it's related to ontology, and it's related to social theories of behavior change. If we do this, then we expect this to happen. For instance, in something like a nutrition education program or smoking cessation, there's a certain behavior that you want to affect in a population. How does that come about? How do people change? How do people start doing things differently? What is the relationship between structure, like their physical environment and what's around them, and agency, or their ability to act and to be agents in their world? All of that goes into praxeology. I think it's perhaps sometimes neglected within evaluation, so I just wanted to add it to the list so that we could think about it in relation to these other types of philosophical assumptions. So here is the tree metaphor, just because it's a simple way of looking at these 4 branches. We're not going to focus too much on the roots. It's important to know from whence evaluation came, sort of especially in the US, the Government Accountability Office and similar bureaus, which started in sort of Great Society era to start to want to know what's happening with all of the money that they're investing in social programs. But then out of those roots grew these 4 branches: methods, use, values, and social justice. And Mertens and Wilson connect each of them to a common paradigm. So the branches are connected to these paradigms, which could be seen as epistemological positions generally. The top 3 certainly are: post-positivist, pragmatist, and constructivist, are generally seen as epistemologies. So if someone says, "What is your epistemology?" you could say, "Oh, I have a post-positivist epistemology or a pragmatist epistemology." Transformative is perhaps more axiological and praxeological because it's about changing things, but it's also connected to knowledge. So in that sense, it's an epistemology as well. So again, this analysis probably doesn't always hold true, and a given evaluator might go back and forth between the different paradigms in different branches, but generally speaking, as the text says, this is the way it breaks down. And so the next 4 chapters will look at each of these in more detail. So we're gonna be going over these in a lot more detail in the coming weeks. But just really quickly, post-positivists, and sometimes just plain old positivists, is the typical scientific method, basically, where there is an absolute reality out there, and it is objectively knowable through empirical methods. And methods, particular methodologies, are the best ways to get at that reality. So, and true positivists were most interested actually in predicting the future. So in a sense, economics is still largely positivistic, because generally that's what they do in that discipline, is they use empirical data to try to predict future trends, not usually with very much success. Apologies to any economists amongst you. Then the pragmatist paradigm is more associated with use, and so use is often associated with Michael Patton, and according to Mertens and Wilson, it's a little bit of an anything goes. There is this end goal of making the evaluation useful, as Patton would say, and we'll look at this week. Primary intended uses for the primary intended users. For him and anyone in the sort of utilization-focused evaluation world, that is the ultimate goal. And so if you need to do surveys, if you need to do focus groups, if you need to do a randomized trial, if you need to, whatever you need to do to make it work, to solve that problem of getting that evaluation to be useful for the important stakeholders, then that's pragmatism. Then constructivist epistemology is, like I hinted at earlier, the notion that humans, as they encounter the world, are co-creating knowledge. They're constructing knowledge. It's often, probably many of you have learned about constructivism in terms of education. Going back now, over 100 years, it's been a fairly dominant trend within education research to think of knowledge not as being sort of stumbled upon or discovered, but being constructed in the learner's mind, if you will. So in evaluation, constructivism is important in that, say you're interested in people's experiences in your program. You're offering some program, something's supposed to be happening for them, but you're also interested in their lived experience. Well, you might not have one particular method, like a random experiment, to get at their experience. The best way might be to use some qualitative methodology to try to understand the phenomenon that is their experience. And according to Mertens and Wilson, this is associated with the values branch, where people's values, people's lived experiences are really the primary material that you're working with. And then lastly, but certainly not least for Mertens and Wilson, because they make no, as you will see when you get to this chapter, they make no secret of the fact that this is the version that they prefer. This is the paradigm and the branch that they prefer. And this is the idea that fundamentally evaluation is supposed to be a force for social justice in the world. And this is the paradigm they call transformative. So people from the post-positivist methods branch would see transformative social justice work as inherently biased, probably, and taking too much of an advocacy stance. But vice versa, people from the social justice branch would see people from the methods branch as perhaps being out of touch with important changes that need to happen in the world. Because fundamentally, this is one of the only things that almost all evaluators agree on, is that we want to use program evaluation to make the world a better place. And so, as educators, we're running our programs to try to improve something. And then if we layer on top of that evaluation, we want to use evaluation to help those programs make more of a positive difference in the world. So that's true up and down this list. It's just that each of these camps comes at it from a different perspective. And so it'll be really interesting as you work with these different branches and paradigms to see, as of now, where you sort of feel most comfortable based on your own personal and professional experiences. And then over the course of the semester, who knows, you might change as you learn about different evaluation examples. So this just sort of sums up some of the things I was just talking about, but I think it's a handy figure as well. So what are the paradigms? What is the role of the evaluator and the relationship between the evaluator and the evaluand or the participants? What is the role of knowledge and power and what's supposed to be going on? So that brings us to our questions for the week, and so I'll be asking you to respond to some of these in the discussion section, and hopefully this will spark some good discussion. I hope some of you, for number 4, come up with some creative and interesting metaphors. There's a number of metaphors for evaluator roles listed there on page 44, like judge and detective, which are great metaphors. I've heard them before, but I'm wondering if anyone can come up with some new creative metaphor for an evaluator role. What stands in for the evaluator role? Could be the quarterback. Could be, who knows? I don't want to give you any examples because I don't want to steal your potential metaphor. So have fun with that, and also I look forward to reading your critical reading responses again. And never hesitate to email me with any questions you might have, especially as we get into these thick concepts around theories and paradigms. It can be challenging, but again, I believe that it will serve you well as you try to learn evaluation and do better evaluation in your work. All right, thanks.